Very good. Thank you, Rona, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Just give you a little bit more background about myself before I jump into the slides that I prepared. Before I came to graduate school here at the U, I went to Brigham Young University, and I have a bachelor's in molecular biology from there. And a little bit of laboratory experience, but so I have some technical background, but most of what I've been doing for the past 20 years has been focused on implementing, how to implement the technology that's available to improve the public health. And so as I was preparing the slides for today, I talked with Rona, and she encouraged me to really play to my strengths, and so we're going to have mostly a policy lecture for you today about how do you add a new condition to the mandatory screening program in Washington. And if you're, so you know, this is a case study in Washington. If we were to be in Colorado or Massachusetts or anyplace else, it would be a similar process, but it would be all different because we all have different ways of administering the newborn screening programs. It's a state-based program. So excited to be here with you. I'll give you a brief overview of what we're doing to give you, hopefully to impress on you the importance of the work. And then I've got two case studies. One is a condition that we added already to our panel and are going full bore with daily testing, and then one that's in process. So hopefully it's both interesting and informative to you. I don't have anything to disclose. So as we're thinking about newborn screening, often people just focus on the laboratory test. And it's important to remember that newborn screening is much more than just the laboratory test. It's an integrated system that does universal screening for all babies and then follow-up to make sure the right things happen for babies that have abnormal results. And then a subset of those babies are going to be the ones that are diagnosed with the condition. So we need to assure that those that are diagnosed receive the treatment that they need. And then evaluation of the overall effectiveness of the system. So why is it important? As Rona mentioned, it prevents death and disability by providing early treatment prior to symptoms happening. Also benefits the public through savings in healthcare costs and disability support costs. And this picture here is a great example of what we do. So both of these little girls are 6 years old. They both have congenital hypothyroidism. And you can see the one on the right has grown, normally developed, as a baby was identified as having hypothyroidism, put on synthetic thyroid hormone replacement therapy, and developed normally. The one on the left you can see has severe stunted growth, also has irreversible and severe intellectual disability associated with the imbalance in the thyroid hormone as she was developing. So just to give you an idea, there are 90,000 babies born each year in Washington State, and our laboratory does all the testing for them. The first screen is required by law, but it's standard of care that they get a second screen at about 1 to 2 weeks of age. So we're processing about 180,000 specimens every year. And so that equates to, on a given day, we receive between 500 and 800 specimens usually. Of those, about 5,000 babies have abnormal results that need some sort of follow-up. The vast majority of those are babies that have a hemoglobin trait, so they're a carrier for one of the hemoglobin disorders, but in the end, about 200 babies every year are identified through newborn screening and have some sort of condition that's on our panel that benefits from early identification and treatment. So the analogy of a needle in a haystack is really a good one for what we're doing. We're casting the wide net so that we can identify the few that really need our help. So this is my son, Sam. He was born in 2003. And up here in the corner, you'll see that when he was born, we were testing for PKU, hypothyroidism, adrenal hyperplasia, and hemoglobin disorders. And then 2006, this is my son Jake, and when you can see that our panel had expanded significantly in those 3 years. This is Will. He was born a couple years later, and he actually was born a couple of months before we did a pretty big expansion. And Ben was able to take advantage of those extra conditions that we added to the screening panel. And rounding out our little family is Lily, and she was born 2014. That's the year that we made the most recent expansion for SCID, or severe combined immunodeficiency. And that's going to be one of the case studies that we talk about today. So it's been pretty, and I started work just a couple months after Sam was born. So I've been around for this big expansion, and Rona's been a great help from the biochemical genetics standpoint as far as adding these conditions and having the support for diagnostic testing and services for those babies. So it's been a fun ride. And while there are hundreds of different things that we could be testing for, we really have a focused number of screens. There's 28 right now, and the State Board of Health, which is separate from the Department of Health but a sister agency, has the legal authority to decide what it is that we screen for. So they have come up with a series of criteria that a candidate condition needs to meet in order to be included on the mandatory panel. So early identification needs to benefit the newborn. There needs to be treatment that's effective, that's available for the babies. The nature of the condition justifies population-based screening rather than just risk-based screening. That there's a good screening test that exists, that's sensitive, specific, has a good predictive value. And then finally, that the benefits justify the cost of screening. So when you take a look at what's out there as far as tests that are available, there's a small number that meet these criteria, and those are the ones that we're screening for now. But what we're going to talk about today is, if you know of a new one, what would you do about it, and how would you get the analysis to move through this public process to get it included on the mandatory screening panel. So among these 28 that we're screening for, there's some that have super high urgency. These can be life-threatening in the first weeks of life. We consider them, if we have a presumptive value on any one of these tests, then it's a public health emergency, and we are calling out the dogs. We don't go home until we know that the baby is taken care of. We have a group of 4 follow-up staff that interpret the results and then communicate with the doctors and nurses to make sure that those babies are okay. And we want to get these kids seen and on treatment as soon as possible. Then we have a moderate group. A lot of conditions fall into this realm where we certainly don't want to wait around to initiate treatment, but there's a little more, the urgency level is not quite as high, so we're hoping to get these babies on treatment within the first couple of weeks of life. And then there's a couple other tests that we're doing that the timing of it isn't as critical. So still, we want to help them get diagnosed and on treatment as soon as possible, but there's a little bit of wiggle room for these. So how is the testing done? We have a variety of different testing platforms, and I'll talk to you about them right now. The one that has the biggest bang is tandem mass spectrometry. Right now, from one little single punch from a blood spot filter paper card, we can test for 19 different disorders. There are the amino acid disorders like PKU, organic acid, and fatty acid oxidation disorders. So we have a couple enzyme activity assays where we're using spectrophotometers to determine the amount of activity. We have a PCR instrument, and we'll talk a little bit about SCID, which is done on that instrument. The hemoglobin disorders are done through isoelectric focusing. We get, actually, depending on how you count it, you can get a lot of different hemoglobin disorders just from one single punch. And then we have fluoroimmunoassays doing testing for some of the hormones. Those are each individual, one disorder per punch. All right, so here we go into our first case study, and this is severe combined immunodeficiency, or SCID. Now, this was made famous by a boy named David Vedder, who had an older sibling with SCID who died, and then when he was born, they immediately tested him. They put him in a germ-free environment, and then he ended up having SCID and grew up in this environment. Also made even more famous by John Travolta in a movie about SCID. So symptoms start during the first couple months of life when the maternal antibodies protection wears off. They get recurrent infections, and some of them can be life-threatening, like pneumonia, meningitis, or sepsis. And these sicknesses don't respond to antibiotics. So for many years, only the babies that had a positive family history of SCID were able to benefit from early detection and treatment, which is a bone marrow transplant. Here's data, and I'm borrowing a bunch of slides throughout the presentation from colleagues of mine. This one's from Troy Torgerson and Suzanne Scota-Smith, who are immunologists at Children's here in Seattle. This is information from Rebecca Buckley out of Duke and her data. So this is a survival curve. And so you'll see here, this is the percent surviving after an intervention. And the intervention is a stem cell transplant. But what's critical about this part is that the babies were transplanted after 3.5 months of life. So this was after they got sick. And you can see that there's a pretty significant mortality rate associated with the therapy or the intervention, which is the bone marrow transplant. Especially compared, if you catch them before they get sick, or the data was from siblings or family members that were able to benefit from early diagnosis, you can see that the survival curve is much better. So we're talking 96% versus 66%. So there's an opportunity, if you can catch them early, to do good things. So Jennifer Puck at UCSF developed this elegant screening test for using blood spots, residual blood spots. So same exact medium in which we do our daily business, she was able to develop this assay. And it stems from the fact that when the T cells are developing in the thymus, part of their development is that they have a part of the DNA that's excised. So there's this, it's called a TREC, or a T cell receptor excision circle. So it pinches off and becomes this episome. And so as the cells divide, that episome goes to one of the daughter cells and continues on. So the idea was, if you could measure the number of TRECs in a baby, if you saw TRECs, then you would know the baby had a functional immune system. And if you didn't see TRECs, then you would be worried that that baby would have SCID. So she developed this TACMAN polymerase real-time PCR assay. And it takes advantage of the splice site where the episome is created. And so we have primers that are going on either side of this splice site, and you amplify the region in between to see if you get any product. So this assay was pilot tested in Wisconsin and Massachusetts to see if what's in a research laboratory could be done in full production for 90,000 babies a year, for example. And it's found that it was feasible. And so at that point in 2010, the Federal Newborn Screening Advisory Committee recommended adding SCID to what's called the RESP, which stands for the Recommended Uniform Screening Panel. So this federal board doesn't have any authority over the different states, but they have recommendations. And so SCID came up on this recommendation list in 2010. So here's where we get into the policy piece. So we have this compelling reason why we would want to identify kids with SCID. So how do you make that happen? How do you change the law? I really like this quote. This is from a member of the Illinois House of Representatives in the late 1800s. It says, "I have come to the conclusion that the making of laws is like the making of sausages. The less you know about the process, the more you respect the result." So we're going to learn about sausage making today. So if the Department of Health wants to change the law, there's a series of steps that we need to go through, and it's all mapped out on this flow chart. And as I mentioned before, we're partners with the Board of Health, who has the authority to change the law. So they have this other process that they go through. And as you can see, they run in parallel, and it's really easy to do. Okay, good. We got the laughter. That's exactly where you're supposed to chuckle. And as you can imagine, there's some forms that you need to fill out. Okay. Yes, there are forms. So I'll give you a little SCID timeline. What did we do to make it happen? So in 2010 was when the recommendation was made. We filed a decision package, and that's basically the department telling the governor, hey, we want to do something. This is, and what we wanted to do is add SCID, and we couldn't absorb the testing into our current fee. It requires new technology and staff members, and so we needed to increase our fee in order to add this test. That decision package got halted because that was a year in which the governor said no new taxes, and a fee increase was thought of as like a new tax, and so our efforts to add SCID were paused for a short while. In 2011, we were very hopeful because the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention had a funding opportunity to help states get started on screening for SCID. And so we applied for that, and they gave out 3 grants, and we were in 4th place. So just barely missed that one. And we held an advisory committee to review SCID against those 5 criteria in 2012, because we wanted to be ready so that when the environment changed and we could go forward with this and increase our fee, we would be ready to go. The advisory committee recommended adding SCID, and the State Board of Health accepted that recommendation unanimously, and they said, we understand that you need the funding in order to do this, so as soon as you can get it, go for it. So in 2013, we submitted a new decision package through the agency to the governor. There was a second round of CDC fundings we were hopeful for. They gave out 2 grants, and we were in 3rd place that time, so we didn't get it. But the board approved the change into law. The legislature said, yes, you can increase your fee. And in 2014, January, we started screening for SCID. So this is the only test that we do across the board for all babies. It's a DNA test, so we have a DNA extraction procedure that we follow. And then it's pretty neat. We have the real-time PCR instruments that we use can test a whole bunch of specimens all at the same time. So we take from 96 well plates, and we put them into 384 well plates, and so there's a matrix that's associated with that, and we have robots that do all the pipetting for us. And these are the instruments. That's what they look like. They're VS7s, pretty similar to the Quant Studio, if you're familiar with that. And this is the output for a given run of baby specimens. So what we're doing is every cycle of this real-time PCR assay is doubling the amount of DNA in between those primers. And so it takes several cycles here to generate enough DNA copies to have a signal. And so what you see at the bottom here on the left is just kind of background noise. But then at a certain point, it passes a threshold, and this yellow line and the blue line are the 2 thresholds that we're looking at. And after it passes that threshold, we understand that there is DNA present for whichever sequence it is that we're amplifying. And so for our test, what we need to know is, are there no TRECs, and did the DNA amplify? So what we do is we run beta-actin, which is present in all babies' bloods, just to make sure that we extract the DNA properly. So if we found a result that didn't amplify for TREC, but also didn't amplify for beta-actin, we would be worried about there's something interfering with the specimen, and we would want to get a subsequent specimen for that baby. Now, if we have beta-actin signal here, crossing this threshold, and then a few cycles later we have TREC crossing the threshold, then we know that this baby's fine. What we're looking for are the babies that have beta-actin passing the threshold, but not TREC. And so with each plate that we run a series of controls and standards so that we can create this standard curve. And the red boxes are the standards, and the computer will take the signal from the baby and plot it along this pathway for us so we can know what the concentration of TREC is in the baby's blood. So it's pretty funny. I was talking with the lead worker in the laboratory who helped develop the test for us, and this was a fortune cookie that he got while he was developing this test. And so what he was in the middle of doing when he got this fortune was looking at a whole bunch of different laboratories protocols and taking the best parts from those, because maybe Massachusetts has a really high volume of babies, and so they do the multiplexing with the 384 plates, well plates, and then but the Wisconsin method for DNA extraction had a better extraction. So he sort of mixed and matched what, and we've been really happy with what he came up with. It's been doing really well for us. That said, there are some limitations to the testing, and there's some challenges associated with screening for SCID. The clinical status of the baby can cause the TREC levels to be low. For example, micropreemies sometimes have low TREC values, or they have values that kind of bounce around a little bit. If the baby has heart surgery and the thymus is removed as part of the procedure, then they'll have a false positive test result. We also find that the screen identifies more than just the kids with the severe form of immunodeficiency. It also detects kids with T-cell lymphopenias. So babies with DeGeorge syndrome or Charge syndrome, or there's some other transient things that happen. So it's been really interesting working with the immunologists on the kids that we have positives to find out what's going on and how they can help them. So treatment, as I mentioned earlier, is bone marrow transplant for most of the babies. It has the best success rate if it's done early. There's also the adenosine deaminase deficiency form of SCID that there's a gene therapy for. So here's our cutoff scheme. So we're looking at for borderlines that are in this range. It's not normal, but it's not really worrisome. If they're in the NICU, we just wait for a subsequent screen that usually resolves it. If they're not in the NICU, then we'll just call to request a subsequent newborn screen. And almost always that'll resolve the abnormal borderline result on the first. Now, if it continues to be persistently borderline, or if we have a value in the presumptive range, then those are babies that we refer for diagnostic testing. And the diagnostic test is called flow cytometry, and they do it just up the road around the corner at Children's. This is a way to count the cells. It's pretty fancy. And so this graphic shows that the cells come in, a laser comes through, a detector decides, okay, that's this type of cell, and then it goes through and it hits a counter, and then it produces this beautiful graph that's really colorful, and I have no idea how to interpret that. But the immunologists do, and so we refer for this flow cytometry, and then they figure out which babies need help and which ones don't. So pretty amazing technology that they have over at Children's to help detect these kids. This is a picture of Ezra Dixon. He was our first baby that we detected with SCID. And within the first, I don't know, 4 or 5 months of testing, we had found this baby. And he ended up he had an older sibling who was a perfect bone marrow match, and so they did the transplant, and he's doing wonderfully well. So cool thing about SCID, as compared to everything else that we test for that has a treatment, this treatment is curative. And if they make it through the procedure without graft-host disease or any sort of rejection like that, then after a couple of years of follow-up with the immunologist, they're good to go. So it's pretty exciting, and he became their poster child. We got a little thing in the mail saying, hey, please donate to the Hutch because we do wonderful things, and there's a picture of Ezra on there. So pretty fun, and really neat to see after working for so long to try and get this to happen, it's really cool to see it working. All right, so that's the one that we've already done. Now we'll talk about one that's in process, and I'll let you know where we stand. So Xlinked adrenal leukodystrophy is a paroxysomal storage condition. It was, if you've heard of Lorenzo's Oil, the movie was about a boy with X-linked adrenal leukodystrophy. So this is a genetic disorder that affects both the brain and the endocrine systems. It's X-linked, meaning that it primarily affects males, but in female carriers is pretty interesting because female carriers of the ALD mutation often develop mild symptoms in mid to late adulthood. So if they're just carriers, doesn't mean they're out of the woods as far as that's concerned. The prevalence is about 1 in 17,000 boys, and there's 3 different main forms. The most serious is a cerebral form, and that affects about pretty close to 1 in 50,000 babies. So if you're thinking in Washington, about half the babies born are boys, we'd probably see this real severe form about once every year in our population. So there is a laboratory test that to screen for ALD, and so this is a slide from Nancy Zakes, and she and her husband came to the Board of Health because they had a child, Ethan, who had ALD. And he was diagnosed when he was 10 years old. He had a pretty typical presentation for the cerebral form in that he was an active kid, loved to skateboard, and just had this great childhood, and then things started going where he was having a hard time paying attention and having problems in schools, and they misdiagnosed him with ADHD, and so they went through this odyssey to try and figure out what was going on with their son, and they found out that he had ALD. Within a couple months, he had a bone marrow transplant. Unfortunately, a few months after that, he passed away. And so Brad and Nancy approached the Board of Health in 2014 in April and said, hey, what do we need to do to get this added to Washington's mandatory panel? They're screening for it in New York, first state to start screening. We should be doing it here in Washington. And so they, over the past several years, they've been wonderful partners with us as far as figuring out how this happens and being with us through the journey of adding this condition to our panel. So the first thing that we needed to do as they approached the board was we formed an internal work group, and we involved members of the Board of Health. This happened right at the same time that the board was taking a careful look at those 5 criteria that I showed you earlier. They actually convened the Newborn Screening Advisory Committee, which is an ad hoc committee, to look at the criteria. They had been developed about 10 years previous, and they wanted to make sure, are they still good, or do they need some modifications? And so it was important the leadership felt that it was important that this review of the criteria should be done before the next review of a condition. And so that happened first, and actually at the same time the Federal Advisory Board was considering ALD. So the Board of Health requested that we convene the advisory committee. It's a multidisciplinary group, has representatives from the medical field, public health, the principal payers, insurance companies, advocacy groups, and ethicists. So it's a broad group of people that have a stake in the newborn screening program and what we're doing. So that technical advisory committee meeting was held in October of 2015. It was a full day meeting. The morning was spent learning, helping everybody come onto the same page about what is ALD and what are the implications thereof, and then they applied each of those 5 criteria to, applied it to each of the 5 criteria. Here are some slides that were shown as part of those presentations, and it'll help you understand a little bit about what's going on with ALD. So boys with the severe form of, the cerebral form of ALD, what happens is that the white matter in their brain starts changing. And what's known now is that if you can catch that early, before there's too much brain damage, before they start showing symptoms, then you can intervene, and that halts the progression of the disease. So it's not like SCID in that it cures them, but it just stops them from going downhill into losing mobility and becoming deaf and losing consciousness and going into coma and dying. So you can stop it while they're still pretty healthy. And so kids that are diagnosed pre-symptomatically with ALD, the boys will go through an annual brain MRI and they'll look for patterns. And as soon as it first starts changing, if it does, so there's about 35% of kids with ALD have this form, so if it does, then they know to intervene. So here's another survival curve. You look at the lower part are the kids that have severe brain involvement and were not transplanted. The top of the curve are the kids that were transplanted before they had the brain involvement, and you can see a big difference in the survival rates. So that was compelling information for the advisory committee. This is data out of New York, so this is by Joe Orsini, my colleague from New York, shared this with us. And so they had tested for almost 2 years worth of babies in New York, almost more than 400,000 babies during that time frame. So they have a much larger population than we do. Of those, so the first tier was a tandem mass spectrometry analysis of the very long chain fats. There were 7,000 of those 400,000 that needed additional testing. And they made referrals on 38 of those cases. 14 of them were boys that had an ALD mutation. So those were diagnosed. There were 6 that didn't have any mutations, and then there were 18 that were female carriers. So of those 6 that didn't have a mutation, most of them were Zellweger syndrome, which is a different peroxisomal storage disorder. So a related condition, but different. So that the advisory committee recommended to push to add this to a newborn screening panel, and so the Board of Health met in January of 2016. It was approved by the Board of Health as for mandating screening, but they knew 2 things. One is that the fee needed to be increased in order to add this test, and then we were at the very beginning of a laboratory expansion project. We needed more space to do the testing. So I'm going to give you updates on where we stand on both of those things. The first is the budget authority. So I think I mentioned earlier that newborn screening is fee for service, so we charge a fee, and then that's how we are able to do the testing. And we're not going to be able to absorb this into our current screening fee. So we drafted a decision package in May of 2016, submitted that internally, went up the chain within the Department of Health. Our request was submitted to the Office of Financial Management, which is the governor's budget office, in August of 2016. It was included in the governor's budget. We're very happy about that because as an executive agency, if the governor doesn't want to do something, then we're sort of out of luck. But it was included in the governor's budget in December of 2016 and ended up in both the House and the Senate budget last year in March. The tricky part was they had differences in the way that they worded the newborn screening increase in the fee and a different mechanism how it would be recovered. And so that needed harmonization because it has to be, the exact language has to be agreed by both houses, or both bodies. So at almost literally the 11th hour on June 30th, the end of the biennium, the legislature passed a budget, and newborn screening fee increase to add ALD was included in both the budgets. So we were happy that they authorized us to increase our fee by $8.10 per baby to do this testing. Now that's going to pay for 2 tandem mass spectrometers. We're doing a lease purchase so that we can pay for it over a period of 5 years, so they're pretty pricey. But that allows us to spread that cost over time. But also it pays for consumables, the pipettes and the plates and the reagents and everything that you need to do the test. It also pays for personnel, so we have laboratory and follow-up personnel that we'll be adding, and then overhead costs. So after the legislature approved the fee increase, there was a public hearing by the State Board of Health in August of this past year, and the board approved filing the final paperwork to change the law. So we're right at the end of that big old long flow chart. We still needed to buy those mass specs though, and mass specs run about $350,000 a piece. We knew we wanted a Xevo TQD. We had one in the lab already. We have 4 mass specs in operation. This is the most recent one we've got, and we knew it could do the test for ALD. The one that we currently have is testing our routine group of amino acids and acylcarnitines. So way back in January of last year, we started the paperwork and working with Waters Corporation and back and forth about, okay, this is what we need, and they said, okay, this is the paperwork, and back and forth. And it was just sort of moving along slowly. And then when the budget was approved, we started working in earnest with our contracts manager at DOH and with Waters. And on the 29th of September, the contract was finalized. And it was 287 pages long. All the terms and conditions and everything from both sides. At that point, we submitted a request to the Department of Enterprise Systems, which is our Department of Enterprise Services, I believe. We only have authority to spend $50,000 on any given instrument. And so they have to authorize if we're going to spend more than that. And 2 mass specs cost way more than that. So the Secretary of Health sent a letter to the Secretary of DES asking for this additional delegated authority. It was granted to us at the end of October, so that's another 3 weeks or so. We had everything ready for this sole source justification because we knew the type of mass spec we wanted. We had one already. We didn't want different types of mass specs. There's a lot of complications with having different types of instruments in a lab, and we want to reduce the chance for error, so we wanted to use what we knew would be good. So we put together this sole source justification ahead of time. As soon as we heard, yes, you can spend lots of money, we said, okay, here's the paperwork for the Xevo TQDs. That was on October 25th. It was approved on December 5th by DES. We we sent in the procurement request for the instruments on December 11th. And we had been working with Waters for a long time about this, so they knew we wanted mass specs, and they had them ready to send to us, and they sent them right away. So they were delivered on December 22nd. And I prepared my slides yesterday. I finished my slides yesterday, but this morning we met with the Waters folks, and they're coming on Monday, and they're going to install them. We're so excited. Oh, it's been, anyway, so as you can see, it's a pretty involved process just to get the instruments in to do this testing. So our go live date is March 1, and we are validating the test on the existing Zevo that we have. When we get the new ones in, we'll be going gung-ho. The last part is our construction project. It's not done yet, but we're getting really close. This used to be our storage room. It was originally built so that it could be easily modified into a laboratory space, and about 2/3 of the storage room is turning into a mass spec room that has capacity for 10 tandem mass spectrometers. So we're gonna, by the time these two new ones are in, and we have one from the University of Washington that's part of a research study, we're gonna have 7 mass specs in this space. And that should happen by the end of this month, where we should be in that space, so we're really excited. A part of the construction is also around that we needed some storage space now, and so we built a shell around the new laboratory space, and we'll have storage and then additional office space. As you can imagine, we've expanded the number of conditions to our program. We've also expanded the number of people that work for us to follow up on abnormal results and do the testing, so we need extra office space too. So it's looking good, and we're getting close on that, and very excited about that. Since we weren't busy enough already, we've got some other things that are happening. We've got 2 new conditions that are coming towards the end of next year in the fall, and they are lysosomal storage conditions. They've already been reviewed by the advisory committee and approved by the Board of Health, and they're for Pompe disease and mucopolysaccharidosis type 1, or MPS 1. So the University of Washington has been partnering with us for the past 10 years to develop new methods for screening for lysosomal storage conditions. So the methodology for Pompe and MPS 1 is one way to do it. One way that programs currently are screening for it, not outside of a research study, which is what we're doing, is through a tandem mass spectrometry assay that was developed by Michael Gelb and his colleagues here in the Department of Chemistry. There's this really neat new technology that's called digital microfluidics. That's also an option for screening for Pompe disease and MPS 1. And it's a really interesting technology, and it has some drawbacks as far as the specificity. There's a really high false positive rate. And then in conversation, so those are the 2 main options that are being done outside of Washington in states that have already added these 2 conditions. What's super cool and we're very excited about is Michael Gelb was listening to us grumble about the current assay that we're doing for, it's an enzyme activity assay for galactosemia. And it's been pretty fickle over the years and has given us a number of headaches. And he and Ron Scott were thinking, well, we might be able to do a mass spec assay for galactosemia, and we do biotinidase deficiency as enzyme activity. And so he's built this 5-plex that is for research only, but it's something that we're very interested in. It combines galactosemia biotinidase deficiency, which we're currently using those enzyme activity assays. It includes ALD, this is all in the mass spec, and then Pompe and MPS 1, and this is some preliminary results. He said that it was okay for me to show you, but it's pretty neat that he's developed this assay that will, and so over here is where the start of the assay, and over a period of a couple of minutes, each of these peaks comes off at different periods of time. So it's going to be able, we're hopeful that we'll be able to take a look at this, and this looks like something that we might be able to add to our current program. We're very interested to try it out. So pretty exciting, and now you get to see the stork that's gliding across the screen with my contact information. And our lab is in Shoreline. We're just a few miles away. We love to have visitors. If you want to come, please let me know. We'll take you on a tour of the facility. And if you wait for a couple months, you'll be able to see the new mass spec room. So thank you all for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Hi. Thanks, that was a great talk.
Okay.
I had a couple questions.
Sure.
Number one, in the discussions that have been ongoing amongst the federal government about potentially regulating laboratory-developed tests through the FDA, do you know, have public health and this type of testing been exempted from that, or do you think that that could potentially happen? And the second question is, without getting too deep into the merits of federalism, this doesn't need to be a political discussion, just there have to be other countries that do this on a national level. Are there advantages to state-by-state regulation of this, or do you think that maybe having a single policy across the country might be advantageous?
Okay, good questions. So the first question, remind me, please. Sorry.
Is the FDA going to regulate?
Yes, thank you. Lab-developed tests. Okay, so that's a really important question to us because about half the tests that we're doing are lab-developed tests. The other half are kits that we buy from vendors. Our understanding in conversations from probably a year and a half ago was that newborn screening is a small fish in the pond, so to speak, and they were really low on the list of the FDA's they're going to pick off the low-hanging fruit or the biggest bang for the buck or whatever. And my understanding is that the current administration is not really interested in regulating a lot. So I think we're in a time period which suits our laboratory really well because we're not worried about that right now. A few years ago, we were worried about it, but it seemed like we were pretty far down on when they were going to start working with us. I know the Association of Public Health Laboratories, which is a wonderful advocate that we work with closely, gave the federal government lots of feedback as far as the importance of what newborn screening is doing and the flexibility that we need. So some programs won't add a newborn screening test to their panel unless there's an FDA-approved test available. Ours is not that stringent. So that answers your first question. Your second question is, would it be great to have a national panel? So that's a rephrasing of what you said. And there is a national panel. It's PKU and hypothyroidism and adrenal hyperplasia and hemoglobin disorders. So yeah, there's a group of like 24 or 25 conditions that are screened for in every state. So there is a group of tests that have met everybody's criteria. I find it very refreshing that each of the states has its own process, and some states states are different demographically. They have different ethnic groups that are prominent in their populations, and so one size fits all doesn't really, I don't really subscribe to that belief. But there is this threshold of a group that has met all across the board. So, does that answer what you want? Yeah. And I think we learn a lot from each other. So what other programs are doing, we can learn from, and does that make sense to add to our group's testing battery? Any other questions?
Yes, so I read an article once that said that it was a miracle that in the United States we were able to get any newborn screening at all, given how opposed we are to government overreach into individual lives, let's say. But it's really wonderful that we do have newborn screening, so thank you. Do you think there are any other situations where universal screening may be useful or important, especially with the advent of much less expensive genetic testing?
Well, Okay, so there are a number of things that are on the horizon for us in newborn screening, with varying, right now, as the evidence stands, I think there's a couple that are pretty good, and there's some that are looking promising, and then some that people say are promising that I'm not buying yet. As far as using DNA as a frontline test for screening population of newborns, it's too messy to do that. There's so much variation. There's so many polymorphisms. It's a lot of data that we don't really understand. So an example of that is California's new screening algorithm for cystic fibrosis shares the first tier with us, which is a test for immunoreactive trypsinogen, which is a pancreatic-associated protein. And then we look at that protein over a period of time to see if it's persistently elevated. They'll take an elevation and they'll go back and do a DNA test on that same blood. So just one specimen, we do two. And then if they find 2 mutations, that's a presumptive diagnosis. They send them off for the sweat test, which confirms it. But if they only find 1 mutation, then they reflex to a gene sequence. And they have found all sorts of things that they weren't really bargaining for. And I think, so there's this whole new condition that's called cystic fibrosis-related metabolic syndrome. It's not typical CF with the lung involvement, but there is some organ involvement, and some people will say, yes, it's important to detect these kids early versus maybe not, and depends on who you talk to find out what they think. But they're finding more kids with this CRMS than they are finding with kids with CF. The main reason is because they're doing this DNA sequencing, and there's just a lot more than, you lift up the rock, and what's underneath the rock is not really that nice to look at. So, in a limited fashion, I think DNA testing is going to be really important. What we do. Yeah.
Thank you again for a beautiful talk.
Oh, good.
I'm curious, what is the long-term fate of the dried blood spot cards, and how are they stored? Are they available for later research? What are the rules and constraints about that?
Perfect. So the Attorney General decided that the residual blood spot filter paper card is part of the child's medical record. So medical record retention laws apply, and so that's 18 years plus 3. So we hold them for 21 years. And they are stored at room temperature. We have some at our facility, and the rest are at the state archives in a secure facility. And with IRB approval, researchers can access those specimens. They're the RCW and the WAC that govern so the laws and administrative code that governs what we do spells out how researchers can access those screens. So with parental consent, they can get personal information about the babies, and so you can link that with an actual child. There's stipulation for anonymous research also, the parental consent can be waived in certain circumstances. But any time that you would want, if you're a researcher wanting to access this wonderful population DNA sample that we have, you need to go through the IRB approval. So, and it would be your institution plus the Washington State IRB. You need both. Yeah. And we've had lots of really cool research that's been done over the years. Pretty interesting things that have been going on. The biggest study was a diabetes evaluation study. So they looked at so this was a parental consent. So they went, and actually a couple of our kids were born at hospitals where they did the study. And so after the mandated screening was done, then they sent the study people in to take punches from, and then they looked at certain HLA regions that had a higher risk for type 1 diabetes, and then there were a couple different studies, but more than 100,000 families participated in that research study, so it's pretty neat. Is anybody going to come visit us? Hope so. Okay. Thank you.